The Russia-Ukraine war, trying to get that one resolved, trying to get things settled with Venezuela, trying to start another war in Iran. And oh, what about China? Let's don't forget about them too. A lot of things going on in the world today. President Trump is at the middle of all of this. We have Europe trying to figure out where their place in the world is, what's going to happen with NATO. So many things to discuss today. And we are very grateful today to have with us Colonel Douglas Macgregor, Defense and Foreign Policy Analyst, former advisor to the Secretary of Defense, highly decorated combat veteran, and big-time friend of the show. Doug, welcome back as always.
Sure.
Well, listen, really grateful to have you on today because, like I just said on the outset here, there's so many things going on here, and really grateful to you to kind of help separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, and tell us what's really going on and what's really at stake here. And I want to start off with the Russia-Ukraine war because we just had this big pomp and circumstance in Paris a week or so ago, and everybody's talking about security guarantees and ceasefires and all this. And at the end of the day, it's like crickets. It's like it's the same place we were. It feels like before that meeting as we are afterward. And then there's news out that I guess came out yesterday that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are headed back again to Moscow in the aftermath of Paris. But one wonders, what do they expect to have difference? Here's what Sergei Lavrov said today is what he's thinking.
Putin is always open to a serious conversation, and all previous meetings with the special envoy, Mr. Witkoff, and Mr. Kushner joined the conversation. These were serious conversations that were aimed at addressing the root causes of the crisis in Ukraine and to elaborate to address these root causes, because without doing that, we cannot achieve lasting peace.
There he goes again, back to those root causes. Those darn Russians, they don't ever change their mind on that kind of thing. He always goes back to the roots. And I didn't hear anything about roots in Paris. What do you think?
Welcome to Trump world, which is a world where atmospherics and optics pass for substance. And I think President Trump is still looking now what he was looking for in the past, which is a win for Trump. Where's the win for Trump? How do we get a deal on the table that Donald Trump, can stand up and take credit for? That's really what Witkoff and Kushner are being sent over to do. Now, I don't know what the two real estate tycoons are going to do in Moscow. I'm sure they're going to be looking for deals on the side, which seems to be something they do everywhere they go. But as far as substantively, are they bringing something to the table that reflects things that Russian national interest could accept? I'm unaware of any. I doubt seriously that's the case. Are we reading the mail? Do we understand, based on things that have been stated publicly, previous documents that are being submitted going all the way back to December of 2021? Do we understand what the Russians want, what they're trying to achieve? Do we understand this idea of a new security architecture? You know, we have President Trump that wants to see himself as the future, the bright, fresh, strong wind from the West that's sweeping away the old and bringing something new. Well, what are we bringing to this that's new? Where is the new security architecture that's going to pull Europe out of the doldrums and create peace and tranquility on the ground? Look, I think it's back to optics and good feelings designed to make Trump look great. It's everything is about making Trump great again.
Yeah, that needs to be the new acronym. The one thing that puzzles me a little bit here is, and I just wonder how long will the Russians keep being congenial and saying, yeah, sure, we'll talk to anybody, come on over here again, especially when Witkoff in particular has been there many, many times in the last 12 months. And they have been emphatic about saying, here's our position. It has never changed. And especially coming after Paris, where none of those things with the root causes were even mentioned here. I truly don't understand what Witkoff is going to be bringing to the table that is anything different than anything before. And where is this even going to go? How can you get some kind of side deal if the main deal isn't even changed?
Look, you're preaching to the choir. I think what we would see if it were serious is a significant meeting in Western Europe between us and the Europeans. Now, is that going to be up to Messrs. Kushner and Witkoff? I don't know. It's whatever Trump decides to do. Is that going to be something that Secretary of State Rubio conducts? But one would expect someone who represents the president with a team that sits down with either every major player or just those states that border Ukraine and Russia, or with the NATO Council, whatever. But something has to be hammered out in advance that takes into account European interests and desires. Now, if those European interests and desires are completely incompatible with what we want to achieve with Moscow, then that needs to be stated, just stated right off the bat. We cannot come to an arrangement with our European allies, because what our European allies want is effectively perpetual hostility with Moscow. We, on the other hand, would like good relations with Moscow. We want to normalize. In other words, where are the stipulated goals and interests? Has anybody made any of this clear to anyone in Washington, let alone in Brussels or anywhere else in Europe? I don't see it. I talked to someone earlier today inside the Beltway who's in a good position to know, and he described what's happening as a compass that has no polar direction. In other words, the needle is just spinning and spinning and spinning. There are vague directives coming out of the president, but nothing substantive and nothing concrete. And people are scrambling in every direction to try and satisfy the president by doing what they think he wants. This is not how you run an administration. It's not how you govern a country. It's not how you lead an alliance. It's not how you do much of anything. And I think that's what we've got right now. We have controlled chaos. We have the president who controls everything, but the control is chaotic. The goals are unclear. The directions are vague. What comes out at the other end of this process? Chaos. So we'll all be interested to see what happens. But I think, as always, President Putin will be polite. But President Putin, in the meantime, I think, is building up his military capability. He's increasing his arsenal, and he's preparing for a worst-case scenario, because he doesn't necessarily see evidence that we want to avoid a confrontation. He thinks that President Trump wants to do it. He imputes goodwill there, but there's no plan to avoid it. If you're going to avoid a confrontation, if you're going to forge an agreement, there has to be a plan and a strategy and a pathway to get there. None is visible. He knows that. He's always provided what he says is his path. Now, if you don't like his path, look at it, pull it apart, pull the pieces out that you could accept, put some of your pieces in, and start talking. But this microwave approach to diplomacy is a dead end. Send the two microwave technicians, Witkoff and Kushner, and expect them to come back with a finished meal in short order, so that Trump can wave a paper and say, "I have peace in our time." It's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen, Doug. And one wonders, how much longer this attempt at narrative control at the expense of ground truth reality. You and I have talked about this many occasions about, what's actually going on the ground. I mean, we could talk about the deindustrialization of Ukraine. We can talk about knocking out their energy, their heat, everything like that, all the stuff on the front line. We've talked about that a lot. Well, there is another factor that was out, a very rare moment of genuine honesty at the highest levels in Ukraine by their defense minister, who just released this.
Я не хочу бути популістом, хочу бути реалістом. Міністерство оборони потрапляє в мої руки з мінус 300 мільйонами українців, які знаходяться в розшуку, і 200 тисяч СЗЧ. Тому нам потрібно вирішити, зробити нашу домашню роботу щодо тих проблем, які є сьогодні, для того, щоб можна було рухатися далі.
So he's actually talking about 200,000 that are AWOL in a certain category. There's another category. They kind of have them two different ones. It's like desertions. It's total of about 500,000 Ukrainians. That's on top of how many they have killed and wounded and the daily casualty count. So he's being honest and saying, we're not having them. And you see that headline there that's further. 2 million Ukrainians evading mobilization. That's evading even getting in there, on top of the AWOL and on top of the casualties. Doug, I mean, just from a military perspective, you can't keep the narrative up much longer if one side is literally on the verge of collapse.
But you have to understand that that's an unacceptable conclusion you just reached in Washington, D.C. The Ukrainians, if you're living in Washington, are admittedly at a low point. With just some more money and more technology at their disposal, more effort from us, the Ukrainians can win this war. And people actually say those things, and they genuinely believe it. It's beyond delusional. There's something else here that we need to bring up that he doesn't mention as defense minister. What about all the billionaires from BlackRock and other companies and corporations that are trying to buy up what's left over from Ukrainian farmland, who want to go in there, get control of the breadbasket of Europe and exploit the hell out of it for profit? Those people are also in the sidelines, and those people are connected to the two billionaire real estate tycoons that are going to represent, theoretically, American national interest in Moscow. There's so much corruption in Ukraine and so much corruption going on, frankly, in Washington in connection with Ukraine. It's hard to imagine anything being agreed to in Moscow by the Russians. Because the Russians, we don't understand the Russians. We seem to think that the Russians are just interested in the destruction of Ukraine, or if they can't destroy it, they want to march to the Polish border. No, the Russians are not interested in destroying Ukraine, never have been. They have tried very hard to avoid killing large numbers of Ukrainians, but thankfully, with the help of the brilliant luminaries who run NATO, all these general officers like Kavoli and others who've planned one offensive after another, the Russians have had to slaughter large numbers of Ukrainians pointlessly trying to attack to the east. What they want is an end to the war, and they would like to see a Ukraine that is profitable, healthy, but Ukrainian, a sovereign national Ukrainian state that is neutral and not hostile to Russia. That's it. And no one wants to give it to them because you've got too many crooks in the kitchen cooking up this corruption brew that steals land and minerals and profitability from Ukraine. So, you know, God bless Ukraine. They're in a terrible position, much worse than I ever thought they'd end up.
Yeah, I mean, almost collapse is the only way it can go even worse from here. I'm just curious on the, as best as you can divine from the Trump perspective, is he aware of these things? And he's just like, all right, well, I'm just going to play for this and I want this other outcome. I know where it's going here. I'll just pretend as long as I can, and then I'll blame it on somebody else, I guess. Or do you think that he's not aware of that? And when he sends Kushner and Witkoff there, that he's actually thinking he's going to accomplish something? I mean, what is your assessment?
Well, first of all, I can't divine with absolute certainty what's going on in President Trump's mind. My perception is, and I think this is a very dangerous perception, is that he really thinks that he's in charge of everything. In other words, he truly believes he is the superpower leader of the world, and that whatever he ultimately demands or wants has to happen so that he can wish things into existence. And wherever he cannot wish it, he tries to bully or threaten something into existence. The idea that there are limits to his power, limits to his capabilities, limits to the power and influence of the United States, limits to the patience of the Russians and others that have to deal with this, I just don't think he sees that. I don't think that's there. And I go back to this event back in the early 90s when he ended up running into, quite by accident, a negotiator for the State Department with the Russians about strategic arms limitations talks or reduction talks, excuse me. And he gave, free of charge, his sage advice to the negotiator, and said the first thing you do when you walk into the room with the Russians is that you walk up to the man in charge, you put your finger in his chest and say, "Screw you." He used a different word. He thought that was a good way to start off negotiations. I think his whole personality, his way of doing business, militates against a serious negotiation with other countries. He expects to bully and to be obeyed. I think that's where we are. And the people around him, frankly, I think are afraid not to do what he wants. I think they want to please the president. They don't want to get sideways with him, whether it's the vice president or the secretary of war or the secretary of state. Now, the secretary of state may have a different role because he may be privately even more bellicose and aggressive than the president himself. Remember, that used to be a problem for President Trump, and now it doesn't seem to be the problem anymore. But certainly others are standing around watching all of this. They're part of it. They don't want to get into a fight over these things, but they're not terribly comfortable with what's happening. But you don't want to put your hand out to the, the wolfhound and pet the wolfhound if the wolfhound is ready to bite. And I think he comes across as someone who's ready to bite. What he wants to hear is you just feed the wolfhound whatever the wolfhound wants. So I think that's what everybody's in the business of doing. But the outcome is still moderately controlled chaos, vague notions, no definitive path, no definitive agreements, whatever the boss wants.
Well, Doug, there's a nexus between all these things you're talking about here, this controlled chaos, things international, and then things domestic too. And it's one thing I believe if you're talking about all these senior advisors or senior officials you mentioned and wanting to please Trump and being afraid of the wolfhound, et cetera, you also have the issue of the support that he desperately needs in America to be able to get his agenda done. Remember, we're only 1 year into a 4-year term here, and there's a lot to go on here and a lot that he's going to need support in the American people. And it appears to me that Trump is trying to bully his way onto the American people to make them do what he wants as well, but it's not seeming to work. He was asked a question in an interview yesterday about, listen, when you're focusing on Venezuela, on Greenland, on Iran, and maybe wars over there and all this stuff, your base is not really digging that. And that's not why a lot of them voted for you. And he was asked, what do you say to your base? Here's his answer.
Understandably, a lot of your focus has been on other countries. But when I talk to Americans, when I talk to your own voters, they want your focus to be on them. And they feel like it may be drifting. What do you have to say to them?
Well, Tony, we have the strongest economy maybe in the history of our country. If you went around this plant like I have, they just announced they're going to 24 hours. This is a Ford plant, but GM's the same, Stellantis is the same. They're going 24 hours all around the clock. They're enlarging every plant in this country. We're building more plants in the country than we've ever built. There's no inflation. You saw the inflation numbers. Inflation's very low.
It seems bad.
Wait a minute. Our growth numbers are through the roof. Our job numbers are tremendous. We have 48 days out of 11 months, we've had the #1 stock market in the history of our country. So my big focus is here. But you can't be forgetting about bad threats. You can't be forgetting about an Iran with a nuclear weapon. You can't forget that there's tremendous wealth in the Middle East, and a lot of that wealth is coming over here to build plants. Saudi Arabia is giving us $2 trillion. Qatar is giving us $2 trillion. UAE is giving us $2 trillion. All of that is for the good of this country.
Now, Doug, when people go to the store and when they go grocery, they're not seeing that there's no inflation. It may be moderate by some counts, but it's not nothing. And when people hear Trump say there's no inflation, the stock market's doing great, which most, or at least many regular Americans don't have any benefit from anyway. And then all these claims that all these great things are coming and Qatar's giving us cash and all this, none of that cash seems to get into their pockets. How does that strike the base in your view?
I don't think the base is terribly interested in the stock market. And right now, the base is really largely unconnected to the stock market, as are most Americans. If you listen to Warren Buffett or Ray Dalio or any host of people who are looking at everything, they point out that the stock market is grossly overpriced. Its value is inflated beyond belief. And they are telling everybody to get out. Warren Buffett has largely liquidated his positions. He still has some left, but he's got billions sitting around in cash. He's also invested very heavily in gold. So, the reality and the picture that was created by President Trump are quite different. Now, what do you expect him to do? He's always going to tell you, remember, this is a marketing genius. He understands that no matter what people say, you tell them everything's wonderful, that whatever you're doing is better than everybody else. I mean, this man could sell snow to Eskimos. He's very good at it. But I'm sure others will pick apart the numbers. And as far as all of this wealth coming into the country is concerned, we would like to know where it's all going and how it does benefit the American people. We know that billions have gone into the pockets of the Trump family and friends of the Trump family and the billionaires who are backing him. because increasingly people have the impression that billionaires, an oligarchy of billionaires, are really running us and governing us. And if you look at where the billionaires want to invest and what they want to get control of, gosh, then you find out that we're aligned as a nation in terms of our foreign and defense policy with the goals and objectives of the billionaires. That includes a place like Greenland. You've already got people up there like Ron Lauder and others that are looking at ways to extract minerals in Greenland. Now, it's going to be a tough road. And people are talking about the fact that the ice is beginning to melt in Greenland. Well, if you think that's going to melt anytime soon in a way that's going to be terribly beneficial, you're in for a long wait. But drilling down into the ground through the ice is horribly difficult. It's the same problem at Venezuela. Once we have Venezuela, we'll have all this oil, we'll get all these minerals, we'll control everything, and we'll all get rich together again. You know, it's make us rich and make Venezuela rich. Everybody gets rich. That's the Trump measure of success. Well, that hasn't happened, nor is that likely to happen, because the problems in Venezuela are legion when it comes to extracting oil and minerals and other things. That country does not belong to us. He is not president of Venezuela. And we are not putting any ground forces in there. By the way, I think that's a very intelligent move. I wouldn't put any ground troops into Venezuela either. But the fact that you have no real control on the ground means that you have no real control.
Right. And that's a big part of the problem here, because you can be a marketing genius and you can tell everybody what they wanted. That'll work for a while. But when the events and the fundamentals don't change, and when my pockets stay empty, people are going to start to grumble. And then if it continues on and it hurts them, then things could change. And it seems to me that Trump is digging himself a pretty big problem here. And you talk about controlled chaos a minute, and you just mentioned the issue about Greenland. Whether Trump recognizes that about the ice and how difficult it would be, doesn't seem that he does, because he seems just obsessed with getting it. Here's what he said yesterday.
Before you go to that, just a couple of quick points, because you brought this up earlier, and I think we need to emphasize it. President Trump's first year in office is about to be celebrated. You know, in a couple of weeks, it'll be 12 months since he was inaugurated. He wants a big win of some kind that he can point to as evidence for the success of his government and his leadership. So don't underestimate that. I think there's enormous pressure, particularly on the foreign policy team, to demonstrate that there has been this great success. He's going to try and do it at home. Now, how he does that is something I can't evaluate. We've got real problems here in the United States, and I really wish that he would focus on the good things that he's trying to do inside the United States, which includes enforcing federal law. You know, that's vital and essential, and that should be the number one priority. But I don't know how he does it, but I think we have to come to the conclusion that finding a big win is driving a lot right now as we run up to the end of the first year in office.
Wow, that's such a big point there. I had not contemplated that he could be looking for that. It seems like I missed something kind of obvious. But let's take a look at that, because if he's already going to, thinking he's going to hold up Venezuela as one big success, he's looking at potentially Iran. We're going to touch on that separately. But let's look at Greenland right now, because he seems literally obsessed with "we will take Greenland." Here's how he responded to it just yesterday.
On Greenland, sir, the premier of Greenland said today, "We prefer to stay with Denmark." Do you see that as the
Who
final
said
word?
that?
The premier of Greenland.
Well, that's their problem. That's their problem. I disagree with him. I don't know who he is, don't know anything about him, but that's going to be a big problem for him.
Yeah, he's been making those statements for a while. This is in light of, at least in today's news, Denmark has sent a command group into Greenland as apparently an advanced party on a larger contingent of Denmark military and Royal Air Force. Denmark Royal Air Force personnel are going to go on there. What their intent is, I don't know, but it's looking like that they're saying we may have, this just boggles the mind that this is even theoretically possible. You could have potentially a clash of American military trying to occupy Greenland. At the same time, you have Denmark troops on there trying to defend Iceland. You have Greenland, sorry. You have the premier that's saying, no, there's no way. We don't want anything to do with America. Where do you see this going, Doug?
If you go back to the treaty that we signed in 1951 with Denmark, there's really no limit, as far as I can tell, on the numbers of bases or troops or anything else that we want to place on Greenland. Well, that's the first point. I mean, if we want to enlarge our position there militarily, I don't see any obstacle to that. I don't think the Danes have said that they wouldn't accept that. Secondly, I keep hearing from him, from other members of his cabinet, about all of these dangerous, aggressive moves by the Chinese and the Russians and so forth. Come on, folks, show us where these aggressive moves are. Demonstrate it conclusively. Give us concrete evidence. Show us the film footage. I hear this all the time. You know, somebody was talking to me the other day and said, well, those Chinese are really aggressive at sea. And I asked the man, I said, have the Chinese ever stopped, searched, captured, taken a commercial vessel in the high seas? Well, the answer is no. Well, then who has? We have. So you're telling me that they are aggressive and dangerous, but we're the ones that are stopping illegally, searching, holding, seizing other people's ships. I'm tired of all of these claims, which are accepted uncritically by the American people because it comes through the mainstream media all the time. China is the great enemy. Russia is the great enemy. They have to be stopped, and Greenland is the place to stop them. Well, you know, I'm sorry. I want to see evidence for all of that. The Russians have a portion of the Arctic. There's no question about it. They have most of it, or at least a lion's share of it. We control the others. In other words, if you're on the northern border of Norway, all the way to the northern border of Alaska, guess who is there? We are. You know, and we've been there certainly since the end of the Second World War. We haven't had any problems. Now, when it comes to these things like rare earths, you hear a lot of people talking about rare earths. The largest rare earth find in the last several decades is now right offshore of Norway, in about 200, maybe 250 feet of water. The Norwegian government, for reasons of environmental concerns and other things, has said they're not going to exploit it right now. Well, why not sit down with the Norwegian government if you're in Washington? Sit with them. The Norwegians have been good allies of the United States, just like the Danes, for a very, very long time. The Norwegians, I think, foolishly see a very dangerous and aggressive Russia when there isn't one there. But my point is, go to the Norwegians and say, look, we understand that you have concerns, environmental concerns. Let us help you mine this. We'll defray the cost of mining the rare earths. We'll adopt and try to implement any measures you want to deal with the environment. We're just as concerned about the environment in the North Sea as you are. And let's do this. At the same time, what we in the United States are going to do is we're going to build a rare earth refinery.
Yeah.
So when the rare earths come out of Norway, you're so close to us, part of the package deal is you can come to our refinery and refine your rare earths for nothing. Now, Mr. Trump fancies himself a brilliant businessman who likes to make deals. Make the damn deal, Donald. Talk to the Norwegians. Stop being foolish about Greenland. The rare earths and other mineral wealth that may be under this enormous ice cap, it's not going anywhere, and it remains in Danish hands. And when the time comes and it's profitable to do so, make the deal with the Danes. That's what you do. You want these kinds of relationships on a commercial level, specifically involving rare earths and mineral wealth and oil and gas with your allies. That brings us together. That creates a commonality of interest, which spills into the security environment. Now, what is wrong in Washington? Why are we trying to bully the Danes, let alone the 56,000 people that live on Greenland? It's unnecessary. What I just described can be done. That's a huge win for the Danes, for the Norwegians, for us, for everybody. That's where we ought to be focused.
Yeah, I think you could argue it'd be a big win for Trump. I mean, if he did something like that, that'd be a big win. That's I'd say that's a great deal. I would give him credit for that. But instead, he seems focused on this thing. And one of the things he's pointing out, I wonder, Gary, if you could put that map back up here you were showing just a second ago. I want to take a look at that here because one of the claims is that he said China and Russia will take over Greenland if we don't. Now, as you just pointed out, Russia already has a huge border in the Arctic. Why would they want this? But I want you to focus militarily on the Chinese, because as I see this map, I don't see where China has any kind of a border in Arctic. So what would it take for them to project power into Greenland or with the opposition that we could bring to bear and successfully take over Greenland? How possible is that?
Well, it's not going to happen, and the Chinese are not going to do it. But what the Chinese are interested in, everybody is. The Japanese are interested. Everyone who has anything at sea that carries anything wants uninterrupted access to the Arctic Passage. In other words, they want to sail, between Iceland and Scotland and Greenland and Iceland, and they want to sail up through the Arctic Passage between Russia and North America and Canada and Alaska down into the Pacific and the other way around. In other words, that's your passage. That cuts off a couple of weeks, at least, of the transit across the Pacific or the Atlantic for freight. And that's really what everybody wants to do. In other words, it's the high-speed avenue of approach for trade along through the Arctic waters. We should be interested in facilitating that. This goes back to the notion of protecting the global commons, whether it's space or it's the ocean or the skies, whatever. That's something we should be interested in doing, and we should be interested in facilitating it. That's where you sit down and you work the deals out, and you should have a treaty that says everyone can use this. There will be no interference, but the treaty should also, for those of us that own Arctic frontage, sort of like beachfront property, those of us who have beachfront property on the Atlantic, we want X, Y, and Z, and we have to have control of that. That can be done. These things can all be worked out. But none of this is microwavable.
Right.
And you're dealing with a microwavable president. He wakes up, says, I want to do this, and I want to do it now. Okay. It's like that commercial. We want our money, and we want it now. Come to us. We'll take half the money that you would get. And you'll get your money right now. Forget it. But there is no long-term strategic vision. None. Zero.
Yeah. And back to your idea of controlled chaos, his obsession with this is not just between the U.S. and Denmark or Greenland, but also the U.S. and NATO and the U.S. and the European Commission, who are absolutely in a panic over this. And Ursula von der Leyen was asked this morning, I think it was, Trump is talking all this stuff about Greenland, and he's just going to take it like that comment he made there about the Greenland officials there, like that's his problem, et cetera. So they asked Ursula von der Leyen, what would happen if Trump actually makes good on this? Now, he's going to give an answer here. Listen more carefully to what she doesn't say.
There are many speculations out there about what should be done, what could be done, what may be done. I want to put all this aside and address the general principle of Greenland, that we look at what are the different debates. So first of all, Greenland belongs to its people. So it's up to Denmark and Greenland and only to them. So NATO is one forum to integrate the different interests that are out there. But of course, the Arctic and Arctic security is also a matter for the European Union without any question, that we respect the wishes of the Greenlanders and their interests, and that they can count on us.
Listen, that soundbite there was actually almost triple that length. We just cut it down to keep it short. She just basically said, look, the sun is bright when it comes up in the morning, and by the way, it goes down at night. Just saying lots of facts, never answering the question of what you're going to do if Trump takes it. Just that Greenland can count on us. What does that even mean? What do you think that this is? If Trump makes good on this and actually moves over, what do you think that's going to mean for Europe?
Again, Trump is the de facto leader of NATO. President Trump should sit down with the NATO leaders and say, I respect your wishes and your interests. Now I'm telling you that we want an end to conflict with Russia. And we want you to sit down with the Russians and help negotiate an end to the conflict. In return for that, we'll back away from the notion of seizing the territory of Greenland. And we'll do everything in our power to cooperate as you would like. But you've got to end this war with Russia. That's something that he could do. He could lead the way. He could lift sanctions. He needs to get control of his own government. He's talking to people like Lindsey Graham and this man Blumenthal and others who think it's their God-given right to drive us all into a war with Russia. They have no right to do that. That is absolutely outrageous nonsense. No American wants it. He's the president. He's there to represent the larger interests of the American people, and those interests do not include war with Russia or China, and I would argue with anybody else. But you're asking him to look at the world differently and put these Europeans where they belong, into the place that they occupy. I've always said we are effectively de facto, for all intents and purposes, the modern equivalent of the Roman Empire. What did the Romans do with the Greek city-states? The Europeans are effectively the equivalent of the Greek city-states. Eventually, the Romans said, thank you very much. You're going to behave yourselves. You're going to stop fighting with each other. You're not going to start any wars because it's bad for business. And it stopped, and the Greeks became part of the larger Roman Empire, and there was peace for hundreds of years as a result. He needs to stand up, and if he talks about leading, he talks about being in command. He wants to be the tough guy, the godfather of everything. Well, then act like it, but act like it intelligently. Right now, it's this vague, chaotic approach to everything. In other words, it's like the kid who picks up the machine gun and starts spraying the room with bullets. Well, you'll eventually hit something, but in the meantime, you're going to do a lot of damage, and you're not going to get what you want. And somebody's going to cap you with one round. I mean, that's effectively what it comes down to. I don't want to get that far, and I don't want our country to be capped with one round. But I think the Russians are sick of us. They're tired of us. They don't really trust us anymore because they see what we are discussing, chaos. The Chinese are looking at it from the same standpoint. And remember, everybody in the world wants to do business. But for business to be successful, the market has to be stable. The supply chains have to work. The transportation from one end of the world to the other has to be secure. All of that is up in question right now because of Donald Trump and his chaotic approach.
Well, Doug, if we stop the conversation right there, then people would come away with understanding that there's a lot of problems and a lot of things that President Trump could do, a lot of leverage he actually has to really bring a lot of things to fruition to the benefit of the United States, to the benefit to Ukraine, to the benefit to Europe. He could do those if he was willing to use his leverage. So far, he is not. Now, what worries me the most, back to this issue of chaos, is probably the biggest problem that we have on the horizon right now, and that is with Iran. So the question is, of course, this goes back to 2025 when we attacked Iran, and we had all the two aircraft carrier battle groups there. We were working with Israel, this 12-day war and all that kind of stuff, right? So we had this big power of military buildup. We took this action, and then we stopped. Now then, Trump is saying that he is potentially on the verge of doing something again. A lot of evidence suggests that he is. And he was asked yesterday, Mr. President, if you attack Iran and they make good on their claim that they're going to attack Israel and American bases in the region, what do you say to that? Watch his answer.
Iran says that it will retaliate in the instance of U.S. strikes against U.S. assets in the Middle East. What do you say to U.S. service members about why it is worth the risk to intervene in Iran?
Yeah, Iran said that the last time I blew them up with the nuclear capability, which they don't have any longer. So Iran said that the last time. They better behave.
So they better behave. It sounds to me, Doug, you tell me if you disagree. It sounds to me like he is gambling that Iran won't respond if we come in and hit them hard over this alleged killing protesters or whatever, which is all a big canard anyway. But it sounds to me like he's gambling with the lives of American troops in the region that they won't attack them, because if they do, a lot of these missiles will get right through the air defense and just slice through and could potentially kill a lot of Americans. How do you see it?
I'm sure that the Secretary of War is well aware of the balance of military power in the region. I'm sure that that has been discussed with Vice President Vance. Now, how much have they told President Trump and how willing he is to listen is unclear. But I think we need to keep in mind that, frankly, Iran now has the missile power, the striking power, to effectively annihilate most of Israel. That should not be ignored, because we should have an interest in making sure Israel survives. Israel is operating as a free agent, but it really isn't, because without our backing, without our support, without our readiness to intervene on their behalf, they are at very high risk in the region. It's not just, excuse me, it is not just Iran anymore. Iran has by far the largest arsenal of missiles with non-nuclear warheads of anybody in the world, in all likelihood. We know from previous experience that the hypersonic weapons are absolutely going to penetrate. And we're talking about weapons that fly from 4,000 to 7,000 miles per hour. We have trouble identifying them, tracking them, let alone engaging them. Now, we've come a long way. We've actually created some new radar technology from existing technologies that are better than what we had previously. We have built a lot of missiles, but we haven't built that many. And we're not really in a position, having not mobilized for an all-out war the way Russia has, to match the production lines that exist today in China, Russia, and Iran. Then that brings us to the next point. Will Russia and China simply sit this out? It's pretty clear that if we get involved with the Israelis in an all-out war against Iran, which is what I think we're courting right now, we may not understand that that's what will happen, but I think that's exactly what could happen. The Chinese purchase roughly 30% of their oil from the Persian Gulf region. If that is shut down for some reason, the Chinese have a vital strategic interest, an existential interest in joining that conflict to ensure they can get what they need. Now, how they will do that is anybody's guess. I doubt seriously it would involve troops on the ground. But I think the Chinese would certainly engage in any way they could to support, assist, and help the Iranians, and that includes probably naval power. The Russians are very sensitive to their southern flank, what is south of Central Asia and the nations that touch on Central Asia. And they will become very interested, and they are not going to allow Iran to sink into chaos or destruction. And now finally there's Turkey, and the Turks have always been the 500-pound gorilla in the corner. The Turks have by far the best ground force. They have a solid air force. They are now building most of their own weapons, but they've had their share of economic trouble. Qatar has helped them to survive, as some other nations have. They've got good relations now with the Russians, which I think they want to preserve. They don't want to put those at risk. And I think they would like to get along with us, but they have a big problem with the Israelis and the Kurds. Just a few days ago, an estimated 400 Kurdish fighters tried to work their way in from Syria into Iran. And the Turks and the Iranians cooperated to identify this group of 400 and to annihilate them, which they did. We and the Israelis and MI6 have been backing and pushing and supporting the Kurds against the Turks for a very long time. I think Mr. Erdogan is reaching the point now where he can't tolerate much more, because the Israelis have now established themselves in Syria, south of Damascus, with the potential to actually threaten Damascus, even take it. These are unacceptable developments to the Turks. They're also very uncomfortable with Israeli attacks on Lebanon and northern Lebanon, whether they involve Hezbollah or anybody else. So we have a growing nexus of opposition to Israel, greater Israel, and our influence between the Turks and the Iranians. Now, how far does this go? What will this produce? That's anybody's guess. But at some point, your potential opponents have to ask themselves, How much longer do I hold back? How much restraint do I exercise when it becomes clear that my potential opponents in Israel and Washington are determined to destroy me? At some point, you say, the hell with it. We're just going to go all out because we have no real choice. And if we don't, we're going to be finished anyway. So I think that's the attitude that's growing in the Middle East. I don't think the Chinese and the Russians feel that way, but the Chinese and the Russians have a great deal strategically at risk in the region. And they're not going to stand by and watch us destroy it or watch the Israelis with our help destroy it.
And one wonders, I'm even just looking, kind of circling back to the original post we made at the start of this episode here, where the question was to Trump, how is all these international things affecting the domestic issue and how much he needs that for the next 3 years of things, as you said, some things that are important that, for our own national security on our borders, et cetera. But if Trump takes this gamble that Iran won't do what you just said and finally say, all right, screw it. I don't have anything to hold, only, I have a reason to hold back. And by the way, what you mentioned a second ago, all these protests that are going on there clearly were not just domestically inspired. Mike Pompeo himself was on his X post on, I think, January the 3rd, was bragging about how Mossad is on the ground there. Congratulations. Good job with that. So it's clearly that's something we're trying to foment to cause the casus belli for Trump to go in and do something. If he takes that risk, I mean, what are concerns do you have for how the loss of American troops could be perceived by the base? Will they say, you took this action and now then you're causing Americans to be killed that otherwise wouldn't have? Or do you think that I can only imagine they would, the administration will then try to use their deaths as saying, oh my gosh, see, we have to go further. We have to get into a war with Iran and fight it till we win, et cetera. How would you see that playing out if this spark turns into a flame?
Well, this is highly speculative, and none of us knows with absolute certainty what the response would be. But I think our economy is very fragile. I would watch our bond market very carefully. We just had a massive sell-off in the 30-year treasuries. I would watch for the 10-year treasury carefully, see where that goes. And I'm not saying something that's unique. Warren Buffett has said the same thing. Ray Dalio has said the same thing. Alistair McLeod has said the same thing. Luke Gromen has said the same thing. People that are much more knowledgeable about the financial system than I am, they're all pointing to that fragility. Any perceived setback overseas that involved an indisputable defeat of American military power could have very serious consequences here at home financially for us. And then when you look at the problems inside our country, we don't need to spend a lot of time on that. There's a lot of confusion. We're looking at these anti-ICE organizations that are springing up that are increasingly funded by some of the same people that funded Antifa and Black Lives Matter and so forth. So we have the domestic unrest and discontent being sponsored against this government. Again, I think we should focus here because I think what happens here in the United States will determine the future of our country, not what we do in the Middle East, not what we do in Greenland or Venezuela or anywhere else. But, I hold the minority opinion here in Washington. Most people, as you know, don't see it that way. So I think there's a very high probability that if we did get ourselves into a major conflict with Iran or somebody like that, and we made these bellicose statements that we're going to crush them and we're going to win and on and on and on, the American people probably would not be very supportive of that. I don't think it would resonate at all.
Yeah, let's hope that stays in the theoretical and we don't actually have to find out. But one thing apparently we are going to find out. Now, in the last portion of our show here, I want to talk to you about this because this is something that you've been writing about for literally decades, and that is on the modernization of the U.S. and its armed forces. Now, President Trump has just announced that we are going to spend $1.5 trillion just to profound the biggest single year jump in the history of our country by any measure of $500 billion. Now, you're talking about that's going to come on this fragile economic base that you're talking about. I'm just wondering how that alone would work. But here is Secretary of War Pete Hegseth explaining, I guess, how his theory is that he wants to modernize our force.
Since the end of the Cold War, the defense industrial base in our country has consolidated. This makes it difficult, if not impossible, for new creators of technical innovations to win business at our department. The result is a risk-averse culture that prevents us from providing our warfighters with the best resources that America has to offer. That ends today. Simply put, the United States must win the strategic competition for 21st century technological supremacy. Artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, quantum, hypersonics, and long-range drones. If you talk to Elon Musk long enough, he will tell you how important hypersonics and long-range drones are, and he's 100% correct. Space capabilities, directed energy, and biotechnology are the new areas of global competition.
Now, you might agree with some of the things he's saying, but I worry about how this particular Department of Defense / War is going to execute those things. And I've got one particular question. What seems to be a little odd to me is when he's trying to say you should listen to Elon Musk about what technologies are needed for war. It seems to me that you should not be listening to industry about what we need for war, but warfighters about what we need for war. And then the industry will respond to that. How do you see that whole thing?
Well, the warfighters haven't done very well for a long time, and they have frequently been wrong. So I don't think it's a monopoly on their part that we need to be cognizant of. What I would say is the following. He's right. We went from almost 100 plus firms that were involved in one way or another with defense-related business and production. And we went from that to 5 firms, literally 5 giant corporate entities. Now, how did that happen? Well, that was under Bill Perry. And people are very critical of him because he presided over this consolidation. But Bill Perry has to be viewed in the context of his time. And at the time, Bill thought that he was going to end up dealing with a much reduced defense budget, that we simply could not ensure the survival of these dozens of firms that were otherwise out there as subcontractors. Something had to be done so that we did not lose, quote unquote, our defense industrial base. Bill Perry was a very thoughtful man, a good strategist, and I think for his time, a very good Secretary of Defense. But what we've done with defense is essentially what's happening right now in the media world. We've gone from 50 different media companies across the country over the last 30 years down to 6. This works to the advantage of oligarchs, billionaires who want to take it over and control it and profit from it on an enormous scale, but it hurts the broader picture. I don't know how he gets from the big 5 to a broader and more diverse set of companies in the short run. So that's the first question. That's reversing those trends, I think, are important. I wish someone would start going after these monopolistic big tech firms as well as the media corporations and stop this takeover by a handful of billionaires who in many cases have very sick and demented agendas. I'll be blunt with you. They're not Americans. They don't believe in America first, and they're out for all the wrong reasons. So I wish somebody would go after them the way we went after monopolies in the past, but that's another subject. Second thing is, no one has right now a clear, unambiguous picture of what future warfare will look like, but we have glimpses of it. There's always a danger that you look at one thing. Right now, there's this fascination with unmanned aerial vehicles, drones as they call them, in all sizes, types, and kinds, and their revolutionary impact, which is indisputable. That was obvious back in the 80s when the Israeli Defense Force went into the Bekaa Valley and used the first drones, if you want to call them that, to fly ahead of their advancing tank columns. That allowed them to engage the enemy at range, great range with artillery or air power. It allowed them to avoid problems. It's essentially the same thing as the advanced reconnaissance element that we used back in 91 that was 15, 25 kilometers ahead of us so that we didn't run into problems and we sustained our forward movement. Only now you can do most of that, not all of it, but most of it with unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. That is unquestionably the case. But it's not the only thing. There are a lot of other things out there. He mentioned some of them, and he's right about that. But we've got to be careful that we don't reach the conclusion that it's one single thing or one or two single things that dramatically change everything. We need a holistic picture. And most of all, we need a lot of experimentation. Before World War I, based on our experience in the Philippines and the fighting that went on for several years there, we killed about 250,000 Filipinos, by the way, and we lost perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 Americans in the process. But most of the fighting was in jungles, and it involved aimed rifle fire. Let's stop and think about that. Curious that we should make such a big deal of it, but the Springfield rifles, and later the Enfields, bolt action rifles, were very accurate, and you could fire a lot of ammunition relatively quickly. Everybody decided that's the future. And so everybody put a lot of money into that. The second thing that people decided based on the Boer War was that you needed lots of field pieces that were light and mobile so that you could move around the battlefield and fire and then move to the next point and fire. And so we built lots of smaller field guns instead of larger guns. World War I comes along, and we discover that the man with the rifle is not only not the dominant force on the battlefield, he's quite dead. And what we have on the battlefield that's dominating everything is very heavy artillery and barbed wire, and mines and machine guns and machine guns and machine guns. So you got to be careful that you don't jump to the wrong conclusions. And that's hard to do because you have this problem of presentism. People in the armed forces like what they have, so they're always trying to hammer what's out there into the future. And industry is in the same boat. What's industry want to do? It wants to keep on building the same stuff. I once had a member of one of the 5 firms that I had lunch with, and at the time I was doing work for Department of the Navy. Shocking, but I was. And he said to me, "You know, Doug, do the admirals understand the following?" I said, "Well, what's the following?" He said, "The following is, we are going to build ships whether the Navy gives us ships to build or not." The whole issue at the time was the failure of the United States Navy to provide prototypes, to provide new ideas, new blueprints, new way forward for new kinds of ships. That's how you got this Zumwalt destroyer, $1 billion a copy, which was a catastrophe. I think we eventually built 3 or 4 of the damn things. They were too damn expensive, and they couldn't do many of the things that on a routine basis were required at sea. But he made the point, we're going to build ships whether the Navy wants them or needs them or not. Now, that has to be understood because we've turned these 5 corporations effectively into state-sponsored enterprises. In other words, we're hostage to them. If you don't give us enough money to do X, well, then you could kiss goodbye the last assembly lines, the last docks, the last, building capability that you've got. We've got a real problem right now in a number of areas. We don't need to go through them on this thing, but they haven't changed a lot since I was working for the Secretary of the Navy at that time.
Well, Doug, isn't that what we're doing right now with President Trump's Golden Navy and all that, with all these big Trump battleships that he calls them? I mean, it sounds like they're going to build them whether we want to or not, whether the modern naval warfare says that should be done or not.
But all of this happens in the absence of any strategic vision. Where is the strategy? I'm not talking about, well, we're going to Venezuela next week because we want to get their oil and emeralds and gold and rare earths. I'm talking about, what's this larger strategic vision? To dominate the world? Well, that's unaffordable. That's bankrupting us. That's stupid, So where's the strategic vision? What's important to us? And I've tried to outline this in the past. You and I have talked about it. We mentioned the global commons. It's very important. Everybody should be interested in protecting those and providing access to it. These are things that avoid conflict, that help you nurture good relations, cultivate relationships.
Yes.
Get out of the business of treating the same old states as permanent enemies. Everyone is always in the hunt for a permanent adversary, a permanent enemy that can be routinely demonized and then set up as a paper tiger that you can fight in perpetuity. All this crap needs to go away. And they took a stab at it in their new national security strategy. But as we can see, it's irrelevant. It has no teeth. There is no coherent strategic framework. There are no guideposts into the future. There are no specific goals that are going to shape your behavior, shape your force development, and ultimately your modernization. And the other thing is, stop looking for somebody like Elon Musk to give you all the answers. Oh, he's a smart guy. Of course he's a smart man. I don't think anybody disputes that. He's done many things well. Right now, the Chinese are beating the hell out of Tesla. They are advancing very rapidly in everything that is remotely involves electrification or electronics. They are innovating in ways that everybody said was impossible. So you're not going to get somewhere by listening to one person you think has the answers. And stop listening to people that are already invested in things that you may not want in the future. And don't ask the four-star who's been part of something for 30 or 35 years to tell you what's going to be very different in the future, because he's invested in what is there. Everyone that comes to the four-star level, I'm a custodian. It's my job to keep everything that's here. I can't lose anything. These are service equities. It's why you need a revolutionary strategic vision. This administration can't provide it.
Nope. And I don't see anybody on the horizon that's going to, but that is what we desperately need. And we really appreciate you coming on today and providing such clarity on this, because people can't claim they didn't know, especially with statements like today. So we really appreciate that, Doug. Thanks for coming on.
Sure. Thank you, Dan.
And we appreciate you guys too. Be sure and let your friends know that we are on podcast. I know we say that a lot, but I know a lot of people prefer podcasts. So don't let them miss stuff like this, a show like this one, or with John Mearsheimer we had earlier today, Apple Podcast, Spotify, Podcast Addict. Let people know that they have all kinds of means. We're also on Substack, DanielDavisDeepDive.substack.com. Whatever people want to have their whatever medium they want, we've got it there for them. Be sure to share this with them, folks. I truly mean that when I say like and subscribe on this channel and share this, because we're wanting to make sure more people get the information that you just heard on this show. It is so vital. Please do share this. We really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.